Thanks. I'll have to meet this guy at some point. He sounded great. So thank you for having me. But really, it feels like I'm bringing coals to Newcastle because a lot of the work that I'll be talking about was actually done here by Shagun and David and Jana, who's no longer here. But anyway, so there's a deep Constance connection to everything I'm going to talk about today. And so what I tried to do was to kind of present as much of the work as possible that didn't come from Constance, but I was only partially successful. So some of you will have seen this before. And yes, the departure point from my work is that democracy around the world is in retreat. There is now very little doubt about that, unfortunately. There's a number of different ways in which you can chart this. This is one easy to understand graph for the whole world. And it was published by The Economist, that famous left-wing magazine. And as you can see, from 2016 onward, there's been a relatively steep decline on this index of democracy. And there are other organizations and institutions around the world that study democracy, and they come to the same conclusion. It doesn't matter how you look at it, democracy is in decline. This is the latest report from VDEM, which is an outfit at the University of Lund in Sweden that releases annual reports about the state of global democracy. And the headline news aren't all that encouraging. There are now fewer democracies in the world than there are autocracies. That's for the first time in 20 years. And nearly 3/4 of the world's population now lives in autocracies. So we have a bit of a problem. The question is why? Well, I can't answer that, or no one can answer that in a single talk. So the best I can do is shine a light on one particular aspect that people have cited in this context, and that is misinformation. Now, the reason I feel justified in mentioning misinformation is because of these data, which were published by the World Economic Forum, I think about a year ago. This is based on an expert survey of about 1,500 global risk analysts, experts in global risks. And what they said was that, looking ahead 2 years, their number one risk globally was misinformation and disinformation, ahead of extreme weather events and societal polarization. So there is something about misinformation and disinformation that presents a risk, according to these experts, and that, in my opinion, is directly linked to the decline of democracies. Now, you can look at misinformation in a lot of different ways, and my team and I, we've done this in many different contexts. The particular conundrum I want to focus on today is this one. We have a politician, and he's one of many, not the only one, who has a track record of, making a lot of false or misleading claims. It was 30,000 roughly during his first presidency. That, I did the math, that's roughly 1 hour, 24/7 throughout his entire presidency. So it takes effort and motivation to do that, one would think. Now, that's only part of the problem. The other part of the problem is shown on the right, and that is that throughout his first presidency, 3/4 of his voters considered Donald Trump to be honest, despite that. And this juxtaposition between serial falsehoods and the perception of honesty, that is what I'm interested in, and that's what I want to talk about today, and that's what our team here in Constance as well is addressing. Those two questions. What is honesty or truth? I mean, we all think we know, but Do we really, given these data? What is honesty or truth? And finally, how does honesty and the understanding of honesty that people have, how does that relate to democracy? And that then would be my partial answer of the question why democracy is in decline. It's a tiny little bit of an answer to that big question. All right, so what is honesty or truth? Well, I became interested in this years ago and wrote my first piece on that about 5 years ago. And I was stimulated into, triggered by Donald Trump's, pervasive dishonesty or inaccuracy, and people thinking he's honest. How the hell is that possible? So I looked into the historical and philosophical literature on honesty, which turns out to be quite interesting. And basically, when you look at that, there is some agreement. It's rare among philosophers, but there is some agreement that there are two different things going on. Two different streams are floating around the space of honesty and truth. One is about evidence, and the other one is about feeling, intuition, and in particular, sincerity, sincere expression of belief. And when you look at it further, and you look at the 1930s, then it turns out that under fascism, there was a very explicit commitment by the Nazis to this mystical, inner worldly, kind of folkish, felt truth. And just to make sure everybody felt the same truth, it was their Führer that translated the world into this belief that can only be revealed through inner reflection and acknowledgement of the mythic experience of the soul. And the Nazis explicitly disavowed the possibility of adjudicating political questions through evidence. But instead, it was all about intuition and feeling and sincerity. And this led us to formalize our thoughts in this incredibly sophisticated 2x2 arrangement, where we, first of all, differentiated between honesty on the left and truth on the right. What's the difference between honesty and truth? Well, honesty is an attribute of a person. Truth has something to do with the world. So today, I'm only going to talk about honesty, even though the two are highly correlated and connected, and sometimes it's very difficult to keep it totally separate. But just to give us a bit of focus, let's talk about honesty. Now, the other dimension we postulated is that honesty as well as truth is determined or communicated or understood either by looking out at the world or by looking inside a person. So if I'm sincerely telling you what I think, if I say sincerely, the earth is flat, okay, then that could be a form of honesty that is based entirely on sincerity of expression of my belief, and this is what we call belief speaking. Now, another aspect of honesty is for me to actually say something that's accurate. And so instead of saying the earth is flat, if I say I know the earth is round, then I'm also being honest, but I'm being honest by connecting to reality. And these two sort of aspects of honesty we call belief speaking and fact speaking. In the red boxes, you've got some excerpts of tweets by politicians, which I'll talk about later, that engage in this fact speaking or belief speaking. But more about that later. So we have these two, what we call subjective conceptions of honesty. That is, people think of honesty either within this framework of belief speaking, where we rely on sincerity, authenticity, where common sense is more important than evidence. And this is something that is pervasive in populism, in populist politics. And it stands in contrast to how, in an idealized liberal democracy, we think of truth and honesty because we rely on evidence, and being truthful or having evidence is more important than your feelings. Your feelings don't determine whether COVID-19 is airborne or not. That's a matter of evidence. But there are some people who say, well, it's common sense that it is X, Y, Z or whatever, and they don't acknowledge evidence. So that's the distinction we're drawing. Now, I should add a couple of things about this. That, first of all, these manifestations of honesty, these different ways of communicating, conveying honesty, are sort of endpoints on a continuum. You know, you either communicate your honesty by speaking, belief speaking, what we call belief speaking, which is intuition, sincerity, or through fact speaking, which means evidence and data. So yeah, they're kind of a continuum, but they also coexist. And modern theories of honesty, this being one of them, by Cooper et al., they acknowledge the coexistence of these two types of honesty. And I think, I do too. I think, especially in politics, there are certain things that are value judgments that are not based on evidence, and they are part of democratic discourse. Your feelings about abortion are relevant. It's a value judgment. It's not something you can totally adjudicate with evidence. Evidence matters, even in abortion, but still, there is a value judgment here. So I'm not saying forget about belief speaking and forget about opinions. What I am saying, though, is that if all that is left is belief speaking, then you have a problem. Because then you get into this territory, illustrated anecdotally by 3 statements by various right-wing personalities. Giuliani said on national TV, truth isn't truth. What he meant by that is Donald Trump can say whatever he wants because his own subjective feelings of the truth override any kind of state of the world. That was the context in which he said that. The second person you may not know, she's a extreme right personality in the UK. Well, she used to be extreme right. She's now probably considered to be mainstream. Saying, fact is an antiquated expression. There's no such thing as a fact anymore. And of course, our friend Nigel Far Right Rage said, one man's fact is another man's lie. And that is problematic for democracy, because if that's all that's left, you don't have any means of accountability. You cannot hold people to account if you don't acknowledge at least the possibility of making contact with reality and a ground truth. How do you hold a politician accountable if they can say, oh, that's fake news? No, I never took the bribe. That's fake news. You're making this up. Never mind the video and everything else. But, in that situation, you cannot have accountability. So, that's all a little bit of theory, bit of background. Now, what can we do? Can we identify this belief speaking or fact speaking? The answer is yes. Obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be here. And what we did in this project, Shagun and David and all the other people that are part of ProDemInfo, what we did was to consider political rhetoric. And our goal was to capture the sort of underlying notion of honesty that people seem to rely on even when they don't talk about honesty, even if they're not explicitly contesting a fact, just in everyday language, like in Parliament or on social media when people talk. Are they talking about things from a perspective of intuition and feeling and sincerity, or data and evidence? Now, the way that we did this was to create keyword dictionaries, which we validated by human raters. And to illustrate what I'm talking about, for belief speaking, we ended up, there's a long list of these for belief speaking, fact speaking. I'm just illustrating a few things like basically, I believe, or I feel, I envisage. Those are terms that reflect an underlying idea about honesty that is more based on, well, feelings and intuition than evidence. Conversely, if I talk about analyzing and determining, evaluating evidence, examining it, well, then I'm obviously fact speaking. I'm talking about the world as a source of honesty, not myself and the way I feel about it. So those are the dictionaries we came up with. There's a long validation process here with human experimentation and other stuff I'll tell you about in the next few seconds. And we then converted these dictionaries to embeddings. Now, I decided since I'm in Constance, I don't have to explain embeddings. Otherwise, I would walk you through some geeky stuff about vectors and how you can average them and all that. But here, I'm assuming everybody knows. And in case you don't, basically what it means is that we take the dictionary and apply some mathematical magic, and we condense it into a single vector of 300 numbers. And those 300 numbers somehow magically, but verifiably, capture the essence of belief speaking or fact speaking. And we can then do the same thing with any political text. We can get another vector of 300 numbers representing that text, and then all we need to do is compute the similarity between our dictionary and the political speech we're interested in. How do we know this works? These embeddings, well, we've done a number of things to verify that. One way in which we did it is by looking at 800,000 articles in the New York Times, computing our similarities that I just alluded to with our two dictionaries, and comparing them across different sections in the New York Times. And what you can see is that the science section in the New York Times has a higher similarity with fact speaking than does politics and opinion. Well, that's good because, science should deal with evidence and not intuition. Conversely, the opinion section has a higher similarity with belief speaking than science and politics. You can't compare left and right, but you can go from top to bottom. So, again, that's nice because we would have expected opinion pieces to be higher on this expression of belief than facts. So that's just one way in which we can validate these dictionaries. And we said, yes, we've got something. Let's look at what we can do with these different dictionaries. So did a whole bunch of stuff. I want to tell you about a study of the social media behavior of members of the US Congress. We collected all their tweets, more than 3.9 million for that time period shown there. We identified fact speaking and belief speaking using the dictionaries I just explained by comparing them to the tweets, but then also to the news articles that were shared in those tweets. A lot of the tweets by politicians have links to news articles, so we followed the links, scraped the article, analyzed it, compared it to the dictionaries, and I can now show you in a minute how much these articles capture belief speaking or fact speaking. Just in case you want to know what this actually looks like, here is an authentic actual tweet, abridged somewhere by an unknown politician, but probably a Republican from the context. You reckon that's high or low in belief speaking? Well, if you don't know yet, let me show you the other one. This is another one by another politician. Don't know the party here. Well, the one on the right is fact-speaking. The one on the left is belief-speaking. These are extreme cases. But I think it's pretty clear from that, intuitively at least, that, yeah, wait a minute, this makes sense. On the right, talking about evidence, determination, a judgment. On the left, it's all kind of like, being very polemic and political and scathing. So that's just to illustrate how we can capture different aspects of language. And now the question is, what happens? Now, just to be sure, let me repeat what I said, but I want to make sure that's clear. So far, what we've been concerned with only is rhetoric, speech. Is speech using belief-speaking or fact-speaking? Is it appealing to a notion of honesty that relies on evidence or intuition? Now, we haven't said anything yet about whether that speech is truthful or not. That is a different dimension. We don't know that yet. Now, we have a pretty strong suspicion, and the strong suspicion is that on average, fact-speaking is more likely to be accompanied by accurate information, whereas belief-speaking is more likely to involve misinformation. But we don't know that yet. So let's find out. Let me show you the data of our Twitter analysis. That's a complicated graph. I'll walk you through it slowly. Let's first consider the two panels on the right, which deal with fact-speaking. On the x-axis, we have the similarity of a tweet on top and an article shared in the tweet in the bottom as a function of how much fact-speaking that tweet expresses. So this is the similarity between the content of the tweet or the content of the news article, between that and our dictionary for fact-speaking. The two different colors are the parties using the American scheme. Blue is Democrats, red is Republicans. And what you can see in both cases is that as fact-speaking increases, so does something else on the y-axis. And the y-axis represents the quality of the domain that is being linked to in the tweets, using something called NewsGuard scores. NewsGuard is a for-profit organization that is employing professional journalists to rate thousands of domains in the United States, but also around the world, on the basis of at least quasi-objective journalistic criteria. Like, do they have a way of publishing corrections? Do they separate between opinion, advertising, and news? That sort of standard indicators of quality. And the higher you are on the NewsGuard score, the more likely you are to publish valuable information. What you can see here is a very clear trend. The more the politicians engage in fact-speaking in their tweet, the more likely they are to share high-quality information. And that's for both parties. Now, the Democrats have an advantage over Republicans. They always do. That's just a fact of contemporary life. Doesn't matter how you measure it. There'll always be more accurate information published by Democrats than Republicans. But that difference is slight when it comes to expression involving fact-speaking for both parties. So, cool. The more fact-speaking, the more accuracy. Now let's look at belief-speaking. This is the same material, the same tweets, the same newspaper articles, but now reclassified and re-expressed as a function of how much belief-speaking is in the tweets, that's on top, and in the articles being linked to by the tweets at the bottom. And now it becomes very clear that the more belief-speaking is being expressed in a tweet, the more likely it is to share a low-quality source. And that is particularly accentuated for Republicans. And when you look at the actual articles being shared, wow, the bottom falls out for Republicans. If those articles express a lot of belief speaking, they come most likely from a low credibility source. So what this does, then putting it all together, is to link the expression of honesty to the accuracy of information being communicated in the political arena. Belief speaking is a gateway to misinformation. Now, in this case, it's Republicans that are more likely to avail themselves of that gateway. And that is problematic because, as I've already indicated, if all you have left is belief speaking and sincerity of expression, then you can't have accountability. So that is problematic. Now, the next question we were interested in is, okay, how does the public respond to this? How does this affect the public? Politicians do this stuff, but what happens to the public? Well, we were able to examine this by looking again at Twitter, staying within the same corpus of tweets, but we now considered the replies from the public. This is what makes Twitter so great, because it's a window into what the public does in response to political tweets. So what we were interested in was to see what happens in conversations between a politician and the public. So we looked at 10,000 conversations out of our corpus, where roughly 100,000 replies to 10,000 initial tweets published by the politicians, evenly balanced between Democrats and Republicans. We call these initial tweets the seed. We need to have some terminology here, otherwise it gets very complicated. So we have a politician who posts a seed, and then random or arbitrary members of the public, we don't know who they are, they reply. And when we look at the replies, we only consider the first reply from a given person, because if that John Smith here has another go at it, you don't know whether this one is in reply to a previous other member of the public or the original seed. So we only look at the first reply by repliers. Now, politicians have a party. That's easy. They're either Democrat or Republican. The repliers, we don't know. They tend not to say, I'm a Republican. Well, maybe some do, but we don't really know for sure. But what we do know, or what we can assign, is an ideology score based on other people's work that have published models that allow you to infer for a Twitter user approximately what their ideology is. Okay, so this is all the terminology. Here are the data. Now, lots of stuff going on, so let me try and simplify it. The first simplification is that instead of considering fact-speaking and belief-speaking separately, we mix them up and subtract them from each other. So we have a single number that, if it's positive, means there was a lot of fact-speaking. If it's negative, means there's a lot of belief-speaking. So previously I had separate panels, now I got a single number, same idea, just a simplification for presentation. And now let's look at the panels. On the left, we have a seed from a Democrat. That is the politician, is Democrat on the left, Republican on the right. And what we're plotting on the x-axis is the extent to which the seed is more fact-speaking or belief-speaking. And within each panel, the further to the right, the more fact-speaking in the tweet, as assessed as before by our dictionaries. And now here's the interesting part. The reply is equally classified as being belief speaking or fact speaking. And there's one overwhelming result, and that is that the public replies in the manner in which the politician has initiated the conversation. We call this truth contagion, and it means that if a politician uses evidence-based language, so do the replies. And among the replies, if you now differentiate color, which is the ideology of the replier, basically it doesn't matter. It crosses party boundaries. Doesn't matter whether it's Republican, Democrat, what matters is the language. People respond in kind to the politician's seed. Great, except there's an obvious problem. And the obvious problem is that this is all correlational, and it could be a self-selection artifact. Right? It could be people who only reply to those seeds that are high in fact-speaking because they like it. And then the whole effect is not much, not much to talk about. So, I'll skip over that. To get at this, we first looked at different conversations by the same politician and the same replier on different occasions when the politician changed their language. Now, this is at least ruling out that people only respond to things they like, because it is the same person replying to the same politician on different occasions when the politician changed on their own volition between fact-speaking and belief-speaking. So the question is contagion still present within those dyads? And the answer is yes. It's a small effect, but highly significant. If the seed is fact-speaking, then the reply is higher in fact-speaking than if the seed is belief-speaking. This difference looks small, and it is small, but it is statistically significant. And these are now the same people everywhere. So it's no longer possible that it's simply a selection artifact, but it's still correlational. Thanks, reviewer 3. We had to run an experiment before they accepted the paper to get control over this. Okay, well, I'm glad we did because it worked out beautifully. What we did was to simulate a political conversation under controlled conditions. We generated seeds by AI by taking an actual authentic tweet from a politician on 10 hot-button political issues and asking AI to rewrite it to be fact-speaking or belief-speaking. It turns out you can do that. AI is smart enough to do that. And then we just analyzed the responses. Do people's responses to those tweets, do they change? Let me walk you through the stimuli and then the method to clarify what's going on here. Here we have some sample stimuli about climate change. On top, people who oppose the existence of climate change. On the bottom, people who support the existence, who accept the scientific evidence. Belief speaking on the left. I don't believe in the so-called climate change. It's just a hoax perpetrated by the left, right? You get it. And at the bottom, climate change is a real threat. I know it's true. We can't ignore our gut instincts any longer. So yeah, it is endorsing the science, but it's doing so not by appealing to evidence. And on the right, we have the same idea. On top, some, something that's kind of evidence-based. And at the bottom, something else evidence-based, one pro, one con. You get the idea. So we did this for 10 different hot-button issues. And then in the experiment, people were shown the seed thus created, one of those 4 at random for each topic, and they had to write a reply. That was their task. We just said, hey, we want your replies in these political conversations. So they gave us 10 replies of 80 characters minimum. We analyzed the reply using our dictionaries, and we find, bingo, otherwise I wouldn't be here, that fact-speaking elicits fact-speaking. Their fact minus belief score is above 0 in the responses. The belief speaking elicits a negative number, meaning the response is leaning towards belief speaking. And that difference is statistically highly significant. And now it's no longer correlational. It's causal in an experiment, and reviewers and editors were happy. So, next interim summary. The importance of leadership. This is something that I think is underappreciated, under-researched. The importance of politicians determining what happens. They determine the framing and the outcome of the conversation that follows. It's regardless of the issue being discussed and regardless of the polarity of opinion. That is what's interesting. It works, whichever position you take, even on hot button issues. So just because it's about immigration does not mean that as a politician you have to adapt the framing of the AFD or whatever, or reform in the UK. No, you could show leadership and not buy into that frame. And the public would respond in kind. So how does all this relate to democracy? Final segment, I won't take too much longer. But now I want to talk about experiments that linked the idea of different honesties to people's tolerance for undemocratic behavior. Now, to put this into context, I have to briefly tell you about a paper that we published last year, which looked at democratic near misses throughout history in the 20th century and 21st. What we did there was to look at cases where a country almost lost its democracy, but then managed to come back. And we wanted to identify the accompanying factors that may have been causing this, or that were associated with it. And what we found was, in all cases, that what protected democracies and what failed democracies when that protection was eroded are norms of conduct. Now, no constitution is without gaps. And we're seeing striking visualizations of this in the United States right now, where technically the Constitution is still the law of the land. But somehow that doesn't seem to matter much. And one of the reasons it doesn't matter is because the politicians involved are violating democratic norms that are supposed to fill the gaps in the Constitution. For example, the idea of mutual toleration. That means that any party knows the other party is entitled to power and that they will yield power to the other party knowing that they can come back at a future election. That's mutual toleration. Now that mutual toleration, I would argue, is no longer operative in the United States, where Donald Trump has referred to Democrats as cockroaches and vermin and God knows what else. Okay, that is not mutual toleration. That is not a pluralistic democratic language or attitude. So, what we have shown in this paper is that if norms get violated, democracy suffers. Now, to illustrate that a little bit further, let's look at the connection between right-wing populism and violation of norms. What do we know about populism? Well, populism is a funny thing because, well, at least in my view, and I know there is some controversy in the political sciences literature, so I'm giving you my view on this. Right-wing populism is a thin ideology that is never tied to any specific political commitments. It's not like socialism that has some implied commitment to a political program. Populists don't have a political program. What they have instead is an artificial conflict between, on the one hand, the virtuous people and the elite. Now, that division is artificial. They'll put that division wherever it suits them. Nearly all the time, scientists are on the wrong side of that division. We're the elite. I never felt part of any elite, but never mind. The populists think we are. And what politicians have to do is to recognize and fulfill the people's will, whatever that is. And it is basically antithetical to liberal democracies because it is abolishing pluralism. It is, again, denying opponents a voice because they're, by definition, not part of the people. And this is precisely what happened in the United Kingdom after the Brexit vote, because there was an omerta for nearly a decade now that you cannot talk about Brexit in public because it was the will of the people. How dare you tell us that it was a disaster? That's softening now, but it took 10 years almost to get there. And moreover, within this framework, a violation of an elite norm is considered a strength. Again, a good example from the UK, where Boris Johnson prorogued the parliament. No one in the UK knew what that word meant until he did it, and then everybody looked it up, and now everybody knows it means you illegally suspend parliament. And it was found to be unlawful by the Supreme Court, but it had no effect on his popularity or anybody else's views because he was celebrated for his strength in showing it to Parliament. You know, I'm disabling Parliament, oh, I'm a hero. As opposed to saying, wait a minute, you disabled Parliament? You're crazy. You're trying to be an autocrat. That was not the response. The response was one of him being cheered on. So this is the question now. Why do people cheer on norm violations? Why do they tolerate norm violations if they are so damaging to democracy? And the last question I want to examine is, well, we already know that belief speaking presents a dagger to democracy. We also know elite norm violations do, but what's the linkage? Might those two be connected? I said earlier that if all you have is belief speaking, you don't have accountability of politicians. Well, if you don't have accountability, maybe that is opening the door not just to their norm violations, but also to the public tolerating those norm violations. And this is the last set of experiments I want to talk about, where what we did is to randomly assign people to take one or the other perspective on truth and honesty. On the left, we have telling people, hey, for this experiment, I want you to, think of honesty as fact speaking and nothing else. And on the right, I'm saying, whatever you may think of honesty for this experiment, I want you to highlight the sincerity aspect of it. That saying what you think, what you believe is the only way to be honest. Now, people can do this at random, randomly assign them. And then we're presenting them with vignettes that are describing a politician who is either honest or dishonest, and who's either norm-abiding or norm-violating. In a hypothetical country, a hypothetical politician called Mr. Smith. And this vignette, that's an excerpt of what participants would actually see. In this case, turns out he is norm violating. The government's attempt at bypassing Parliament and judicial scrutiny is unprecedented. Well, that's violating constitutional norms. He also is dishonest in this case. The crime statistics were false. Okay? Now, you can imagine we had 4 of these, so sometimes Mr. Smith was honest and norm-abiding, sometimes dishonest, blah, blah, blah. We crossed the whole 4 different ways of doing this. And then we asked people to tell us whether they supported norm violations. Now, we didn't explicitly call them norm violations. We gave them items like, the prime minister does not have enough power. If an opportunity emerges to expand power, he should take it. Okay? Well, that's a norm violation, but maybe people agree with that. Or, if a prime minister is working for the well-being of the country, he should not be limited in his actions. A sort of claim to be above the law. If I'm a patriot, therefore I can do what I want. Do people agree with this? Here are the data. Now, complicated graph, 4 experiments, 5 dependent variables, 3 independent variables. Whoa, terribly complicated. So let me simplify it by drawing your attention to one panel only, and that's this one here. And that is representing the effects of the perspective on honesty that people are given. And it is looking at people's tolerance for 3 different norm violations: incitement to violence, dishonesty, expansion of power. I just showed you the test items that probe people's agreement with the expansion of power. But we had 2 other norm violations across 4 experiments. Now, ignoring everything else, what you find in that panel is, with one exception, a consistent set of triangles pointing one way. And that is representing the fact that under belief speaking, tolerance for norm violations was significantly higher than it was under fact speaking. And the degree of shading gives you the effect size. So, in other words, across 4 experiments, one exception, across 3 different norm violations, when people are told to think of honesty as sincerity, they tolerate democratic norm violations by politicians. When they're told to think of honesty as relying on evidence, fact speaking, the tolerance declines. And to illustrate the magnitude of this, here's one case where it straddles the neutrality boundary. We have a 7-point scale, 4 being the midpoint. Under belief speaking, people are above the midpoint in endorsing norm violations. Under fact speaking, they're below the midpoint, saying no, we cannot tolerate norm violations. So, the way people think of honesty is fundamental to their acceptance of anti-democratic behavior by politicians. And I'll skip over that because I don't have time. But I do have time for a quick wrap-up. I told you that there are 2 distinct ways in which you can think of honesty. One of them, the intuition-based belief speaking, is a gateway to misinformation. And not only that, it also causes greater tolerance for elite norm violations. And in the experiment I skipped over, we showed that it also leads to greater tolerance of dishonesty in politicians' actual tweets. So, an exclusive focus on belief speaking is antithetical to democracy. But the good news is that politicians who engage in fact speaking are pulling the public along, because the public responds in kind. So there is an opportunity here for leadership. And with that, I thank you for your attention. The QR code goes to my resources page, which will contain the Anti-Autocracy Handbook, which was recently published and is now translated into German as of 2 weeks ago. So if you're interested in how to meet autocracy as a scholar, then you're invited to have a look at that. And thank you for your attention.